three manga. This is three stories that came out in the early 2000s, very close to one another. They garnered worldwide popularity and success back to back to back. All of them have their own soul, their own flavor, their own path to success, but what they share inherently is that they're iconic, that they changed the industry, molded it to what we see today. So many of your favorite stories are inspired by these three manga, so I want to go back and remember them. Naruto was the first, but it wasn't my first manga. When I was growing up, I knew about anime, but I didn't understand it as any kid would. I see it on TV and I just kind of recognize it as another cartoon, right? But I think specifically for Naruto, it was grouped with a lot of other stuff that I would see. So Dragon Ball was airing at the time, or Dragon Ball Z. I think Death Note was playing some stuff in the morning, as well as like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! And One Piece and Bleach. They all were kind of playing episodes back to back. And before school, like when you're in primary school, when you're a young kid, they would play a couple of episodes very early within the morning from like 6 o'clock to like 8 o'clock. So depending on when you'd go to school, you might be able to bust out a couple of episodes while you're getting ready. This was the worst way to experience this story, but it did get you into it. I remember really enjoying Naruto, but not knowing where to go with it. So as a kid, didn't really understand like, you know, manga or comprehend anime or like the differences between it. Like, oh my god, it's Japanese because they played it in English. So I kind of just appreciated what it was, just another cartoon on the TV. Years would pass when I would be, you know, a young teen, going into that young teen era, and I would come across it again. I remember vividly trying to search up Naruto, trying to see, you know, what the difference is between anime and manga, and like what manga was specifically. And all I got hit with was like a panel that was in black and white and in Japanese, and it threw me off so hard because I didn't know anything that it kind of scared me from manga for quite a bit. I don't know what I was looking at or where I was or what the story was going. Did I spoil myself, or were I going back and reading old stuff? But back then it was so much more difficult to find this stuff. Eventually this would lead into, you know, understanding anime and manga, trying to find Naruto and read it weekly, because at that time it was still going, it was incredibly popular, and it was, I guess, niche globally. It didn't have the worldwide appeal yet, but I did go back and I started to read it, and the experience for this story is fantastic. Like, Naruto is one of those stories that feels very warm and bubbly, and really something that you can easily connect to because of its main character, Naruto. In retrospect, it's a really traditionally told story with a lot of beautiful artistry and a lot of beautiful character work, and the pacing, at least from what I remember weekly, was phenomenal. For me, Naruto feels like a perfect opener for people that are getting into the anime or manga industry. You have a plethora of episodes that covers the whole story, or you can read the entire manga. And for something that has like, 700 chapters, that's really impressive. That's an era that doesn't really exist anymore. I fell in love with Naruto because it feels very sincere. Like the character interactions, the character journey, the relationships between them, the grand story. While there's like a lot of big and ambitious and, you know, powerful things going on with, you know, crazy abilities and jutsus, at the end of the day, the core story is really emotional. There's a lot you could potentially relate with, there's a lot you can peel back and explore on your own, and while it never really gets too depressing, there's a lot of strong thematic presence in there that I think Kishimoto done well to balance appropriately. Like, you would have these horrifying things happening to people or around people, but the way that he would showcase it balances it out effortlessly. It really sticks with you, and I think Naruto as a character is so iconic. Having a kind of child like that with that type of upbringing and that type of responsibility and that type of isolation, growing into it and trying to understand it and trying to understand himself. It's this really big journey of self-evaluation, and then you have other characters connected to it that are trying to go through their journey of self-evaluation. In this really big and conflicting, war-torn world where anything can kind of spark and blow up at any moment, it's ridiculous in scale thinking about it, but so beautifully and meticulously handled to its characters, and how much of a driving force they can potentially bring forward. Of course, it has its misses, like every story does, but easily the pros outweigh the cons, both in anime and manga, and the experience is unmatched. When you go back and watch this thing, when you experience it for the first time, or even just remembering it like I am now, it has an aura that surrounds it that just feels iconic. A memorable story that has shaped this industry for the better, a story and a character people will never forget. Bleach was a funny experience for me as a kid. Bleach was the second story that I read out of the big three. The reason I didn't read One Piece at the time is because it had a lot of material and it took a bit of self-convincing to actually get into it. So I started with Bleach. Very different to what I was expecting. At this point, I had a couple of other manga under my belt and Naruto was the ship at the top. Bleach was different because as much as it was hailed as being iconic and revolutionary, its vibe was totally off. Like a complete opposite to everything I would see from One Piece and what I remember of Naruto. I remember going into Bleach and being like, this doesn't feel like something that I've read before. Its opening is very simple, it's very straight to the point, but the vibes were darker, a little bit more moody. The main character was a lot older, like 15, 16 Ichigo, and his personality was sweet and sincere, but it was crusted over with that moody, kind of rebellious teenage aesthetic back then. That first impression is very memorable. Not because I think it's the best thing ever, but because it stood out among the big three. Like, okay, this story is going to be a little bit more moody, a little bit darker perhaps. One of the quickest things that I remember Bleach implementing pretty much straight from the get-go, chapter 1, is its sword mechanic or its sword powers. When you think about swords nowadays, they're dime a dozen. Pretty much anything and everything about swords has been done, and it's rare that you'll see new manga focus heavily on swords. Not impossible, looking at you Kagurabachi, but rare. And it's mostly because I would say that Bleach back then implemented and mastered the sword power usage, but really took it to its limits. Like it has the most kind of recognizable and iconic swordsmanship and power around swords that you could get. And every other story that has tried to use swords kind of loosely follows in its footsteps, either on purpose or by accident. There's another conversation about how it's difficult to mechanically make swords appealing because of how much they've been used and how much has been done with them. But Bleach is the predecessor for that, kind of where it all began. Like if you wanted a sword ability that looked cool, that changed and evolved and really had all these cool powers and elements to it, Bleach was number one. I appreciate that. Because of how early these stories were, the power system was a really big kind of draw. Like you would get hooked by it very easily. Bleach took swords and made them incredibly interesting. Like you would bond with the idea of that power, and it's fascinating how, looking back, kind of changed the landscape for swordsmanship. Personally, I didn't fully connect with Bleach as much as the others. I think it's a fantastic read. I think it's fun. I think it's ambitious. I think it's a lot darker and a lot more moody than its competition, but it does do things differently. How beautiful and poetic it wants to be, and while it's memed on a lot of the time for not having much of a background, I think the approach Kubo took to mastering the craft of his character designs and then the little backgrounds that he would draw and how he would try and slice in this poetic, heavily thematic identity behind each character and each emotion and each action really helped. Like Kubo had a vision of something very grand and very big, and for a weekly story that's difficult to kind of swallow and comprehend. Conceptually, it's difficult to kind of bring that across, and I think a lot of it does fall underneath the experience. A lot of people aren't looking at the poetry, or a lot of people don't want to look at, the thematic aura that it has. But I think if you do, the more you explore the story, the more you unravel it, the more back-end work Kubo has done to not only bring these characters to life, but to bring that poetry to life and how it intertwines with their interactions and perhaps what they represent. There's a lot of characters and I like what they represent. I like how they intertwine with Ichigo. Reading it back then, it felt simple and easy and to the point, but going back and rereading it and playing around with it, it feels so much more ambitious. There's a lot of missteps that I have with Bleach. I'm really not a big fan of the ending. That's just personal reasons, but I do think the journey and the experience that Bleach has offered is obviously revolutionary. Equally with Naruto, while it is long, it is such a great place to start some of the early manga that you should be reading or early anime you should be watching. One Piece is very, very long. When I came across One Piece as a young lad, the first thing I recognized was that, damn, this long as hell. And you know what? It's still going. So many years later, like 15 plus years later, it's still here. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I respect Oda for continuing. Not because he has to, or he's trying to make the most money or be the most popular story to ever exist, but because he's just trying to tell his story his way. And while there's issues with that sentiment on him changing stuff, blah, 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 yada, yada, it's ambitious, to say the least, and you have to respect it. I remember falling so in love with early One Piece because of its charm. Like, Luffy is such a recognizable character, he's such a charmer, but really the sense of adventure I think sells One Piece, especially if you're reading it as a kid, young teenager, maybe a bit younger, maybe a bit older. That sense of exploration and wonder is absolutely beautiful, and you don't get those in the other big three. You get different things for the big three, but One Piece is that adventure, the grandness of the world, the collaboration of friendship and exploring to different places to find new friends to help you move forward and to continue growing together. Like, it's a very beautiful sentiment, right? With a really simple outcome: be king of the pirates, find the One Piece treasure, straightforward. That's what's leading you there. And yet it's complicated. Like, there's so many characters and so many islands and so many little offshoots of adventures that just work so well. But I think it only works really well is because his characters are charming. It has a design philosophy behind his artistry that is different. It's quirky and crunkly and really fits together thematically to work well. Like, all of his characters are drawn in this most obnoxious, weird way. Like, this guy here, he's like 20 foot, you know what I mean? Just a big dude for no reason. He built like that. That's okay. You don't need any explanation. This is a pirate fantasy adventure. Who cares? The more wacky it got, the more charm it would bring in. The more charm the main cast of characters would bring in, the more they would back and forth off each other. Really, the humor is kind of what gets you. I think it's like the secret weapon of One Piece that doesn't really make itself known until the cast starts to form. That's what I found when I was a kid. What I was really loving is the interactions with like Zoro or Sanji or Nami, Chopper or Brook. It was just funny to experience, you know what I mean? I think when that starts to burn, or you start to, get used to the humor or tired of it perhaps, what hooks you is these big, conceptually grand, adventurous ideas. Because this easily could have just been a pirate story in retrospect, go here, go there, blah, 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 take some bad people out, you name it. End of the day, done. But then it turns into this like political strife, turns into these islands at war, turns into military, kind of being confusing and flustered and cannibalizing each other, these warlords that are incredibly powerful beings, these old boys that like wander the seas that are ridiculously powerful, and everything just amplifies more and more. The more context our island has, the more narrative prowess it's going to bring forward, the more you're just going to explore and get the lore of the world filled out even more. This would amplify so much more over the years. Like, he would continue to do it, but make it more intertwined with the main story rather than just being like a character thing. Everything would start to smooth out really, really well. I think if you're mentally prepared and you have a couple of manga under your belt, like 5 to 10 maybe, look at One Piece and just try and chip through it. Try and get to 200 chapters and 400, 600 chapters. I promise you, if you do enjoy it, you'll fly through a lot of things relatively quickly. And I think the charm does convert from anime to manga really, really well. You might have an easier time with anime, but it's going to take you a lot longer. The adventure, the lore, the ideas, the theory crafting, there's so much that this story, Naruto's story, or Bleach's story has to offer. They're all iconic, they're all fantastic, and I'm honestly really, really happy that as a young kid, I was able to find the manga medium, find the anime medium, and experience all of these stories relatively early. They have shaped the landscape to the stuff that you know and love today, and either you're in a position like myself where you've read these stories back when you were a kid, or you're new to anime and manga, and maybe you've always heard about the big three but weren't really sure if it was worth your time. I promise you, it is. Go read these stories. They're iconic for a reason, and they will always be iconic. There will never be a new big three or another group of stories that will ever touch or replace them. They stand on their own as figures of this industry, and you gotta respect that.